This aesthetic right here is the reason why I love video games. It makes me feel in a way that I can't describe, but I also like the beauty of something like this too. Both are great in their own right. Some people might prefer the newer look, but for some reason, I'm drawn more to this. But why is that? It's not just nostalgia, and it's not because one looks more realistic than the other. I feel like there's something deeper here for me to have these feelings. And if you're open up to hearing it, I've got some thoughts I'd be willing to share. Games have reached a point where graphics no longer hold the same weight they once did for me. That wow factor that I experienced when first seeing these games has just completely faded. It's not that graphics haven't continued to improve. Quite the opposite actually. We have made many strides in performance and optimizations, which is good. But visually, today's leap in modern hardware just doesn't feel as significant as the jump from, let's say, the PS1 to the PS2 or vice versa. As hardware advances, graphical improvements have become more incremental.
Distant details are much clearer.
Modern gaming culture has increasingly pushed the agenda that the more realistic and detailed the visuals are, it immediately becomes objectively better, which simply isn't true. This obsession with hyper-realism has led to an expectation that every game should boast ultra-realistic textures, from the smallest pores in a character's skin to the way the individual blades of grass sway when a character runs through them. While these achievements are impressive, they have created a new set of standards that can often feel a bit excessive. Players are now conditioned to expect near photorealistic environments where the slightest imperfections in animation or textures is seen as a flaw. Any game that doesn't meet these lofty visual standards is quickly labeled as inferior. The result of this pressure is an industry that frequently prioritizes visual fidelity over creativity or aesthetic flair. The developers that are faced with the need to meet these heightened expectations often pour a vast amount of resources into something 90% of the players wouldn't even notice, which can lead to bloated budgets and extended development cycles. And I think this is why Astro Bot received so much praise this year and is held in such high regard. It offered a rare glimpse of soul in an increasingly soulless industry, reminding us what games used to be like. Games from the early 2000s and before had a distinctiveness that made each one stand out. And that isn't just because of nostalgia, but because of one thing: limitations. Because of advancements in hardware across generations, games have evolved from looking like this to looking like that. This also comes with making game development easier and more accessible with a wide range of development tools for aspiring creators. However, this progress also led to many games beginning to look increasingly similar, with less of their individual personalities standing out. Developers often rely heavily on these tools' built-in features, resulting in a flood of generic, semi-realistic titles. While these tools can certainly create beautifully stylized games, their true potential is often overshadowed by the mainstream projects that lean into the safe, visually familiar styles. This wasn't much of an issue back in the 90s and early 2000s, when limitations forced games to look distinct, not by choice, but completely out of necessity. Back in the day, most games couldn't afford to be realistic because the technology simply wasn't advanced enough. They couldn't feature multiple models with hundreds of thousands of polygons, thousands of individual hair strands, or environments with deep ray trace reflections, nanite, lumen, or any of the fancy modern buzzwords we hear today. If you wanted your game to look impressive, you just had to fake it. There wasn't any real way to do it back then. A lot of these visuals were done through clever coding, textures with baked-in lighting, vertex shading, etc. And this is why I appreciate a lot of the models from back then. They have a certain human touch to them. If you look closely at the textures, many of them have a hand-drawn and painted quality to simulate depth and realism. Instead of relying on cloth simulations for clothing or detailed skin wrinkles, the artist had to embed that depth through texture work, giving the model a more personalized and unique feel. Because older hardware couldn't handle real-time dynamic lighting, much of the lighting was baked into the textures themselves, making the models look more vibrant compared to their higher resolution counterparts. The textures on newer models tend to be more neutral, to better react to the real-time lighting, but this often made them appear flatter and less distinctive without that lighting. Ironically, in the absence of dynamic lighting, these higher poly models can sometimes look worse than their lower poly predecessors. As I mentioned before, games were often forced to be stylized out of necessity. Even those aiming for realism had to make compromises that leaned into stylization, so that the games could just simply run. Take the original Metal Gear Solid for example. All the human characters in that game had eyes with dark void-like shadows instead of detailed irises, giving them a distinctive, stylized look. This choice, along with the cool color palette and texture work, helped bring the games closer to its 2D illustrations, blending realism with a unique aesthetic flair, which helped the game stand the test of time. But now, you don't need to do any of that. You can give Snake as many realistic eye details as you want, and that loses a lot of that charm for me. Even cartoonier games weren't immune to this shift, as seen with our iconic blue hero,
I'm Sonic the Hedgehog!
In his early 3D appearances, Sonic's renders had a glossy finish that mimicked the coloring style of the 2D artworks. His proportions even aligned more closely with the lead illustrator Yuji Yokawa's art style. But starting in the mid-2000s, Sonic's design began to drift away from that original look. His lips gained detailed wrinkles. His gloves now had more fabric-like textures, his shoes acquired a metallic sheen, and his proportions became more balanced, with his hands and feet resized to be more in line with the rest of his body. As the years went on, Sonic has embraced more aspects of realism, especially in the movies, with highly detailed, lifelike quills and fur. Even the environments, once more surreal and vibrant, have gradually shifted towards a more realistic style over time.
Let's get scratching.
Jet Set Radio, a game built around the bold, early 2000s aesthetics, has also lost some of its original charm. The once striking, blocky, cartoony art style has given way to something that feels closer to reality, which feels a bit disappointing. This shift from stylized design to a more realistic approach has taken away some of the unique personality and flair these games once had. We've entered an era where realistic cinematic visuals have become the standard, and what we need now is a Spider-Verse moment for the gaming industry. Something that shakes up what it means to visually be a game. We need a game that shows companies that it's okay to embrace cartoony, stylized visuals. We want those low poly models, flat lighting, and low-res environments. And if that means the developers can finally express their true vision, then I'm all for it. Because a great man once said, I want shorter games with worse graphics, made by people who are paid more to work less. And I'm not kidding.